The tale of Adonis dates far beyond the creation of organized civilization. He lived in a small but suitable house made solely of mud bricks and thick branches of the native trees to the area. His house wasn't quiet either. He lived among his beautiful wife and young son, who both brought happiness to his life exceeding whatever he could imagine. Every morning, Adonis and his wife Sabrina are woken up by their son Achilles by jumping on them. The life Adonis has been living is second to none and would want this for his remaining life. Who had a very good relationship with Adonis. Quintus thought of Adonis as a son after he had found Adonis as an abandoned child when he was only an infant. Adonis had regular meetings with the king to catch up about progression of the city and small talk about family. The king had a son of his own, Decimus, who always wanted to be close to his father. Decimus had repeatedly tried to be involved in conversations between Adonis and Quintus, but was continuously shut out. Decimus' relationship between his father and himself grew farther apart as Adonis grew closer with him. The city was shook with confusion when they were summoned to the city square for a public announcement. The king had become increasingly sick from a flu that he acquired while visiting a neighboring city to speak about a trading system. The news came to the city in a pandemonium. Would the king make it through and survive? Who would take his place if not? The news came quick to Adonis, overwhelmed with the thought of his friend slowly dying. "I've got to do something," Adonis yelled as he slammed his fist into the wall of his small, unsturdy house. He rushed to the palace where the king was secluded in his quarters. He pushed through the guards and broke into the room where Quintus had looked frail, and his skin was colorless throughout his body. As he lay in his bed, a feeling of sorrow and darkness swept through Adonis' mind as he grabbed a hold of Quintus' hand. The king looked up to him, and with minimal amount of breaths left in his life, he said, "Although you are not my eldest son, nor my son at all, I want you to rule this city. You and your family are the only ones honorable enough to do it. Thank you, Adonis." And with those last words, the king slipped into an eternal sleep. Adonis stood up immediately and knew he had to inform Decimus of the tragedy. As Adonis finally found Decimus in his chambers, he told the news with great sadness and spoke of the king with the highest respect. Decimus was not interested at the least with the death of his father, but more inclined to know when he would be inheriting his father's power of king. "As sad as this is, Adonis, and trust me, I'm devastated, I understand it is my role to step into my father's position. As my father's only son, I will inherit the role as king. From now on, I will lead this city," said Decimus with greater confidence than he would be able to recover from after Adonis uttered the news of his appointment as the new king. Decimus, startled, fell to the ground and looked up to Adonis as if he betrayed him. "You will pay for this, Adonis," yelled Decimus, quickly getting up and rushed out of the room before Adonis could say anything. Adonis wandered around the palace, his thoughts scattered with ideas of what Decimus meant by "he'll pay for this." Adonis knew he hadn't done anything out of his own control that could have hurt Decimus. Quintus' decision to appoint Adonis to king had been solely his decision, without an option. As Adonis continued to flood ideas into his head, he heard faint screams from the city, and looked out to see smoke from a house a few miles away. He knew immediately what Decimus meant now. Adonis sat, head in hands, tears weeping down his face. Sabrina and Achilles lay in front of him, blackened, with the smell of smoke surrounding him. Decimus had committed arson, knowing Sabrina and Achilles were inside the house. The fire quickly spread through the tree-built roof and collapsed on everything and anything remaining in the house. Adonis leaned over, kissed his lifeless wife and son one last time before pulling himself to his feet and storming to the palace. He searched for Decimus, only to find him in the common area with a smirk on his face. Adonis ran to him with a killer look in his eyes, to be stopped and thrown by several guards who had now surrounded Decimus. "Adonis, fancy seeing you here. You're now looking at the new king. I am the only son," muttered Decimus. "Decimus, I didn't even want to be king. You destroyed my life," wept Adonis. Decimus disregarded Adonis and flicked his hand to the guards in signal to take Adonis out of the palace. He was thrown to the streets, face full of dirt and cuts on his body. He stood up, cleaned his face, and looked to his left, only to see a group of men who seemed rough around the edges. They summoned him over and began questioning him about what had happened. They took his tragedy with great sorrow and grieved with him for a few moments. They gave him a poster that had been stapled to a horse stable that spoke about a series of fights that will take place next week. The winner of all the fights will go on to fight the king with the opportunity to dethrone him. Adonis' spirits were lifted the smallest amount and decided to throw himself at the opportunity. The tournament consisted of 3 fights, 2 divisions, and the overall winner would fight the king. Adonis enrolled himself immediately and was accepted as the last remaining fighter. As the day of the first fight rolled around, Adonis was taken under the stands of a massive coliseum and spoke to about the rules. "This fight is to the death. The winner will proceed in the tournament, and the loser, well, muttered a small, stocky man who trailed his last words with a look towards the ground. Adonis knew what he needed to do. The doors of the Colosseum opened, and he was exposed to a great beam of sunlight and the roaring chant from the death-craving fans. He looked across the dirt-filled arena to see an unrecognizable man who stood there. Broad-shouldered, darker skin, and a look of confidence was Adonis's initial thought. He ran at him and was sucker-punched in the mouth before he could think about what happened. He got up, tackled the man to the ground, and threw punch after punch, missing a lot but landing quite a few. He could feel the life of the other man being drained and got off him. The man lay there, motionless. Adonis turned to look at the now chaotic crowd and lowered his head to leave the arena. He was only given a few minutes of break before he was forced to go back into the fighting area. His new opponent looked quite skinny, and with cuts over his eyes and his chest, looked as if he barely made it through the first round. Adonis quickly tried the same plan as the first round, but was countered with a knee to the chest. He got up, kicked the man's legs beneath him, and put his knees on the man's chest. Adonis knew he would regret what he was about to do, but continued, as he was only looking for revenge on the king. He once again stood up, looked into the crowd, and just as he was about to bow his head, he looked into the eyes of Decimus. The fright in Decimus's eyes was already pleasurable, but Adonis wanted more. He was thrown back into the arena for the final fight, but this time was met by something different. A line emerged from the opposing side and ran towards Adonis at lightning speed. Adonis was told for this round he would be allowed a knife, so he was partially equipped for the fight. He dodged the first leap of the lion and caught a swipe of claws to the leg on the second leap. The third leap was too quick for Adonis, as he was pinned down by the lion's vast weight. The lion stood atop of Adonis, looking at what was about to be his next meal. Adonis knew his time was over and looked into the crowd for one last sight. But before his eyes met the crowd-packed Colosseum, he glanced at the knife laying merely inches from the lion's paw. Adonis managed to wiggle one arm free to grab the knife and immediately submerged it time after time into the lion's fur. The lion let out one last roar and fell like a ton of bricks to the ground. Adonis felt a sense of air rush back into his lungs and stood up only to look at Decimus in the eyes. He pointed the knife in Decimus' direction and yelled, "I want you next." The crowd silenced as their king walked down to the floor of the arena within feet of Adonis. Decimus grabbed Adonis' hands to declare him as the champion, but he was unprepared. Adonis grabbed Decimus' hand, threw it down, and pushed him to the ground. Adonis stood over Decimus with a knife in one hand and a clenched fist in the other. He looked into Decimus' eyes and felt a sense of relief, like he'd finally had his revenge. He knew what he wanted to do, but thoughts came rushing to his head about what Sabrina and Achilles would want. Adonis dropped the knife and said to Decimus, "You will leave this city forever, and if you are to return, you won't be as lucky as you are now." Decimus got to his feet, ran out of the Colosseum only to find a horse to flee the city on. Adonis looked down the Colosseum to the cheering fans, chanting his name. He looked up to the sky, reminiscing on the memories with Sabrina and Achilles. His time to honor his family had just begun.